Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the home of the Unitarian Universalism in Central Washington. My name is River Elmes Coonrod and I am a member of the CUUF youth group. I am also the celebrant of today's service. If you are a visitor this morning, we are glad to have you here. This morning, we welcome every person of goodwill, just as you are, however you get around, whomever you love, whatever body you inhabit, whatever your age, you are welcome here. We invite everyone to join us for social hour after the service, both in person and on Zoom. And for the folks on Zoom, you can find your order of service in the chat. It is so good to be together this morning in all ways that we gather. We are glad you are here.
Welcome, everyone. So our opening words this morning are from the late Reverend Betts Weinecke. As we gather this morning, may we learn to recognize and affirm the pieces of possibility, the bits of good we bring. May we encourage rather than control, love rather than possess, enable rather than envy, allowing our individual gifts to weave a patchwork of peace. The soft blue of sensitivity and understanding, the red energy of creativity, the white heat of convictions, the risky, fragile green of new growth, the golden flashes of gratitude, the warm rose of love. Each of us is indispensable if we are to minister to a broken and wounded world. Together, in our gathered diversity, we form the whole. So be it. This is the time in our service when we kindle our sacred flame. If you're joining remotely, please feel free to light your own chalice as well. We join Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists all over the world in lighting our chalices this morning. Please join me, please join River, in lighting our chalice with the words by Reverend Bruce Southworth. For the gift of this day, and for our community of spiritual nurture and compassion, we give thanks. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. May our many sparks meet and merge in communion of heart and soul.
The Journey, a poem by David White, is our wisdom reading for today. Above the mountains, the geese turn into the light again, painting their black silhouettes on an open sky. Sometimes everything has to be inscribed across the heavens, so you can find the one line already written inside of you. Sometimes it takes a great sky to find that, first bright and indescribable wedge of freedom in our heart. Sometimes, with the bones of the black sticks that were left when the fire has gone out, someone has written something new in the ashes of your life. You are not leaving. Even as the light fades quickly now, you are just arriving.
So I'm not really sure when I discovered the poet David White, but I can tell you his words move me. I have found solace and comfort over the years through his poetry. The prose stirring my imagination, particularly when he is reciting them in his Irish lyrical tenor. This morning's wisdom, the poem The Journey, was written for his friend who was going through a lonely and difficult path. White notes, if you are a good friend, the last thing you do when a friend is going through that lonely and difficult path is to say, this is really good for you. And so, in secret, I wrote this poem for her. It was written in testament for my friend's courage, a tribute to the lonely and powerful form of grief I saw in her. The ultimate form of giving away but making space for reimagination. Oh, whoop. Oh, we have somebody that has a joy. I found CUUF, this fellowship, and Al-Anon family groups within weeks of each other. At that time, my relationship of 20 years was ending, and I found myself uncoupled for the second time in my life. In parallel with my personal emotional roller coaster, my 66-year-old mother had fallen into an alcoholic crisis that required family intervention and support. It was definitely a time of powerful grief and great fear. It was the fall of 2008. One particular weekend, I recall I was sitting at home reading the Wenatchee World, the weekend edition, and an article about this fellowship was on the front page of the section I held in my hands. The story was about Reverend Julie Forrest, the newly contracted and first paid minister here at CUUF after the fellowship's 10-year hiatus from professional ministry. It was unusual for me in those days to have interest in reading an article about any religious organization. Resistance to formal religious practice was domesticated into me as a small child, and while I didn't necessarily consider myself an atheist, I still question what led me to sit down and read every word of that story with deep curiosity. As I learned more about Reverend Julie and her family, an inner voice of intuition, a small momism that had been planted somewhere in the recesses of my recollection, erupted into my conscious mind. It was my mom's voice saying to me, "I knew I should have taken you kids to church. If I had taken you to church, this never would have happened," as she watched me pack my bags to leave my first marriage. My discovery of Al-Anon family groups is a similar story. I was resistant to the genuine suggestion offered by my mental health counselor that I attend Al-Anon 12-step support group. At that time, I had cited the capital G God as the reason that I had to decline the suggestion. And this was another example of how I exercised my fierce independence in those days. I've come to recognize that fierce independence as an internalized pattern I learned at an early age. Likely a mask hiding my internal insecurities for stepping into a place I was not familiar with. Finding both Al-Anon and CUUF only a couple short weeks apart provided me dually safe spaces where I could unconditionally explore and come to discover my own spirituality. Over the years since discovering both, I became more comfortable with the faith community I found here at CUUF. I had even started dropping the word church over the years when in conversation with family and friends who were still devoutly committed to their own Christian roots. Using the word church gave me a sense of inclusion and belonging, albeit a false sense, because deep inside I was terrified that someone would engage me in a discussion around the Bible, of which I still to this day, have no true knowledge or understanding of. Fast forward now to February of 2020. I was right here in this pulpit delivering a service. I had chosen the theme of resilient leadership as the focus of the service, and at that time it was intended to be the introduction and eventual invitation into a yet to be determined leadership training series for this congregation. Our settled minister of 8 years was on a much-deserved sabbatical. As a second-year CUUF board member and in the role of secretary, I had offered to support the minister and the board in leadership development in preparation for her return. Some of you may recall I had conducted a small Deb's unofficial survey of leaders within the fellowship prior to that service in February of 2020. And I presented a few curious facts for those of us who like data on the screen. There were some beautiful graphs. Here's just a short little list of some of the survey details that really stood out to me then, and they still stick with me today. 79% of the people who took the survey considered themselves leaders in this fellowship. The three main characteristics of a leader that were identified by this group were accountable, communicative, and encouraging. The result that I hang on to and continue to be curious about is this. The CUUF leaders who took the survey identified creative as a quality unique to themselves, but not a quality of a leader. And the group identified delegative as a unique quality to a leader, yet not as a quality in themselves. Little did I know that chilly winter morning in February, that 1 month later, our fellowship doors would be closed and our congregation would be catapulted into virtual fellowship and worship for the unforeseeable future. We were all thrust into a forced experience of being resilient leaders in our own homes, at work, and in our faith community. Reflecting back, I found myself right back in step one powerlessness, when life became instantly unmanageable. I suspect many of you probably felt the same. I was powerless over a tiny virus, yet my stinkin' thinkin' had me in full force attempt of fierce control of the people, places, and things around me. This is my automatic primal brain survival response to uncontrolled chaos. When my life becomes unmanageable, I often am triggered into hyperfix and hyperhelp mode. I was grateful to have the tools of Al-Anon recovery to lean into during those early days of the pandemic. A quote I learned in the rooms of Al-Anon and have since learned are originally credited to the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who said, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." Looking back over those days that grew into months and now years, I recognize my many spiritual interruptions and little g God shots, as many of my dear friends in recovery call their moments of awakening. I became comfortable with little g God when a fellow Al-Anonic once stated in a meeting, GOD is simply an acronym for good, orderly direction. Oh, okay. So what do I mean by God shot and spiritual interruptions? To me, it's simply those moments or situations that provide an aha or a critical clue along the journey of solving my life's puzzle. I have found when my mind is still and curious, life's clues are everywhere. There are also those times when chaos abounds. And it can take a cosmic 2x4, as my partner Kim calls them, that type of a spiritual situation or spiritual interruption to wake me up to the next clue. The momism I mentioned earlier is an example of a gentle, critical clue that was put in front of me, a divine intervention of sorts. It appeared when I was ripe to begin my journey to the discovery of my soul. Over the course of the last few years, spiritual interruptions in my life came in the form of creativity and art. I've displayed a few of the things here in front of the chancel, and I'm happy to talk about them afterwards if anybody's curious, including Tigster, the mask. At the 2020, as the 2020 survey revealed, this fellowship is full of creative souls. I am grateful to each and every one who provided gifts that supported me through the dark forest of pandemic life. From Kimbrus Bond's lovingly creative painting classes she facilitated virtually for the staff at the organization where I lead, to Shannon Eisert and friends' soul collage community where we gathered virtually and I experienced a deep inner search that resulted in a beautiful deck of cards that exposed deep memories and clues to my life's mystery. Another God shot was working with Teresa Posacani. We had made plans for her to bring her early workshop series to the community, and I had offered to let her pilot her polyvagal playbook lab with my staff in March of 2020. The pandemic quickly forced us to move the lab to an online workshop, and fortunately her gifts equipped my staff with simple tools for their own emotional self-regulation toolboxes as we all shifted from working in the office every day to working from home into perpetuity. The biggest God shot for me personally has been Teresa's Take Care of Your Heart series. I believe I have now achieved groupie status of her workshops. I have participated in 7 of her 6-week workshops to date. The next one starts in a couple weeks. We'll see. Often when I tell my story of, tell my Al-Anon story, I talk about growing up in a spiritually and emotionally bankrupt home. This is not to say there wasn't love in our family. What it means is we never developed a vocabulary of emotions. Only the core sad, mad, happy, and love. While my family may argue that we grew up with a spiritual foundation of love, which I agree we absolutely did, having been raised by adult children of alcoholics, the underlying shadows of attachment, shame, and judgment often bumped up against our fierce love for one another. In Teresa's workshop, all of her workshops, I have found a safe and loving place to explore the shadows as well as the light in my life. I have expanded my vocabulary that not only puts distinct words to my emotions, I have learned there are emotions or qualities that rest in my body. Here are a couple quick examples. Fierce determination. It's right here. My brow gets furrowed and I am determined to get things done. And it just lives right there. My perseverating loop. I perseverate a lot. And that's a word I think that I've challenged a few people on. My perseverating loop, my jaw gets tight. My breathing gets super shallow. And also this brow just gets like, I just get into things like this. When I'm mad, my face gets hot, my jaw locks, and my eyes narrow. There was a spiritual awakening of sorts for me during the 5th of the 7 workshops that I've done. Those were still being held virtually because of the pandemic. It was during one of my passionate sharings about some injustice that I was witness to when Teresa caught a subtle clue into my core emotional belief that I had been carrying for my lifetime. She heard me utter the words, "My heart is broken." And she caught me as my emotional response was spiraling into my hyper-freeze state of locked voice and tears, flood of tears. You all have seen many times my flood of tears. And she locked onto that. And she kept reminding me, your heart is okay. Your heart is hurting, but your heart is whole. You have a big heart. And she just kept holding me and comforting me, and it was virtual. That's what was so incredible. It was virtual. So, as I take a deep breath and work toward the end of this message, I challenge you all to continue to stay curious and listen for any subtle changes within yourselves. Stick with me and stay present. Pay attention to your emotions and where they show up in your body. Check in with yourself and don't forget to breathe. In his book, Letting Go, The Pathway to Surrender, the author David Hawkins writes, the crucial point is, by changing ourselves, we change the world. As we become more loving on the inside, healing occurs on the outside. Much like the rising sea level lifts all ships, so the radiance of unconditional love within a human heart lifts all life. This spring, I was listening to Brené Brown's most recent book, and it's here on the Joys and Sorrows table, Atlas of the Heart. In this encyclopedia of emotions, Brown writes, if we want to find the way back to ourselves and to one another, we need language and grounded confidence to both tell our stories and be stewards of the stories that we hear. This is the framework for meaningful connection. Chapter 6 of her book, titled The Places We Go When We Are Hurting, is the chapter that provided me a gift in the form of a cosmic 2x4. In that chapter, she describes in detail her researched learning on emotions, the anguish, hopelessness, despair, sadness, and grief were all described in that chapter. I can recall the exact day and location I was at when I was in my car listening to her talk about anguish. At the time, I remember listening and feeling discomfort rise in my body. My jaw started to clench. I got a huge lump in my throat. My heart rate was accelerating and my breath shallow, and tears were just under the surface. I remember thinking, I have to turn this book off. I can't keep listening. I have to turn it off before I start crying. Her descriptive words had taken me back to a place, to my 13-year-old self. And the night our family got the phone call that a dear loved one had passed, I heard my inner voice in that car saying, this is how I felt when NL died. I felt anguish. And I didn't know that. When I was 13, I didn't have that word to describe that feeling. When I returned to the present moment and thought, I'm on my way to the Monster Love workshop. Literally, I was. I was headed into the second workshop. I can't go in there in a puddle of tears. So I turned it off. Time to turn Brené off for a little while. Little did I know, at that exact moment, when I was listening to Brené paint the picture of anguish, my brother was receiving the news of the death of his son. News I would receive a few hours later. While this may sound odd, the word anguish was a gift delivered by a cosmic 2x4. The exact word I needed to describe what I was about to feel only a few hours later, when I received the dreadful news of my nephew. But it truly was a gift because I knew what was happening and it was okay to feel. I will be forever grateful to Kimbris and to Sarah Hasslinger, and I have to say to Luke and Stephanie, they were at the class with me, for the therapy in monstrosity. So just an FYI, the Foothills magazine has an article about Sarah that just got published, and that's the title of the article, and it's all about the monster mass that we saw in here this morning. I'm forever grateful for that workshop because that's the series where Tigster the Wholehearted was birthed. Tigster is my soul mask, a mask that allows me to come alive and encourages me to stay curious, creative, and heartfelt. I am grateful to the youth and the adults who willingly played along with my dream of a monster love flash mob for our story this morning. And there will be one in town someday, just be warned. Howard Thurman once said, "Don't ask about what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who come alive." My dear friends, what makes you come alive? Our benediction is by the Reverend Alex Klingenberg. Spirit of life, earth and sea and sky, place of deep longing in my heart. Find your way from silence to voice. Give me strength and courage to speak truth through my life. For I am a creature of the universe, small but infinite, a momentary body in the sea of life, and also the sea itself. I am a gathered bit of energy and one who gathers, a creation and a creator. Let me not hold too tightly to one form and lose the other. For we are not form, but process, ever changing and ever renewing. Help us see that we are neither the beginning nor the end, but something perfectly natural and imperfectly divine. Please join me in the chalice extinguishing words as written in the order of service. We extinguish these flames, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. So our tradition is to join hands in a circle as we sing our closing song. If this is not comfortable, just put your hands over your heart and connect in any way that you feel comfortable. So let's go ahead and circle up. I think we've got room.